Ever since the introduction of Tier 17 maps in patch 3.24, and the subsequent addition of higher-end base types in 3.25, the meta has only gone in one direction in regards to the most difficult and rewarding content in the endgame, and that's the way of blue life. Yes, Energy Shield has been completely dominant for a number of years when it comes to the hardest content in Path of Exile, and there's several good reasons for that. The first is the ramping difficulty with the addition of Tier 17s, not just in the general sense of new challenge, but more so the exact type of difficulty these maps impose due to their extremely oppressive modifiers. Restrictions such as scaling action speed slows based on skill usage, or just outright petrification, forced a meta where the best option was to build a character that could freely avoid the most dangerous modifiers. This allowed them to run maps that other characters simply couldn't do, giving them a huge advantage, especially considering that Tier 17s quickly became some of the most lucrative farms in the game. But that wasn't all of it, because when 3.25 came around, new higher tier base types were introduced, and this pretty much doubled down on the Energy Shield meta. It was now possible to obtain so much Energy Shield, combined with intelligence stacking and items like Ephemeral Edge that allowed you to turn that defense into offense, that these types of builds were close to untouchable at the top. Other setups simply couldn't compete. This resulted in a somewhat stale endgame meta for several leagues in a row, and from 3.24 through 3.26, the Trickster remained on top, largely due to the one step ahead notable. But 3.27 rolled around, and this patch began introducing big changes that would begin to undo the endgame meta that had been firmly set in stone for many leagues in a row. The first of those changes saw heavy, direct nerfs to the Trickster, not least a change to one step ahead that entirely removed the offensive bonus on this node, now only providing a defensive action speed cap, and only when a slow would be affecting your speed. This combined with a heavy nerf to Soul Drinker knocked the Trickster down a peg or two, but only this alone may not have been enough because outside of the use of obscure uniques, the Trickster and the Juggernaut were the only ascendancies to have access to those specialist action speed ignoring notables that made them so powerful in Tier 17 content. But GGG sought to address this problem in 3.27 as well, with the introduction of Bloodline classes, new ascendancy options that could be chosen alongside your core class to provide new options, including several ways to mitigate action speed slows, and these changes resulted in the Trickster finally being unseated from the most played ascendancy following 3 leagues of absolute dominance. And whilst Energy Shield stacking was certainly less prominent in 3.27 compared to previous leagues, it was still the king of deep endgame builds, but more was to come. Enter the current league 3.28 Mirage, and GGG have finally addressed Tier 17 maps in a meaningful way, changing them to be Tier 16 Nightmare maps and lowering the bonuses for loot. But more importantly than that, they also removed several of the most problematic map modifiers from Nightmare and Originator maps, including both the aforementioned action speed slows, finally removing the stranglehold that they've had on build viability in the endgame. But when it comes to defenses, GGG also took the opportunity in this patch to nerf Energy Shield by lowering the effectiveness of intelligence stacking on ES scaling. These changes, combined with many others that we'll get onto in a moment, have had a massive impact on what's being played in the Mirage League. Now, the Hierophant finds itself at the front of the pack for 3.28, and part of that is because the most popular league start build for this league is Kinetic Fusillade Totems, which is able to go all the way through from the early game to the deep end game if necessary, but it also enables a smooth transition to one of the most popular builds for blasting endgame maps for the second straight league, that being Kinetic Blast of Clustering. Now, only about 16% of Hierophants level 95 or higher are making use of Chaos Inoculation in 3.28, with the majority favouring a hybrid approach, and we'll discuss CI in a bit more detail a bit later in this video. But many of these setups are able to get sufficient range damage output, or make use of the defensive nature of the set and forget totem playstyle, especially after the massive buff to totem placement speed to allow totems to act faster, which naturally denies more of the potential incoming damage, and this combined with the most popular single node on the Hierophant, Conviction of Power, with its minimum endurance charges, allows the Hierophant to transition into setups that utilise hybrid defences and block to be sturdy enough to tackle Path of Exile's endgame. However, wanders aren't the only reason for the Hierophant's surge to the top in 3.28. There's also the fact that it remains the most popular self-cast setup with variants of Archmage mana stacking builds, making up over 20% of level 95 plus Hierophants. The most notable of which utilises the newly added Shock Nova of Procession to good effect. Now, sitting just behind the Hierophant is the Necromancer, which finds itself as the second most played ascendancy for the second league in a row, and similar to 3.27, the Necromancer in Mirage League is backed by one of the most diverse sets of builds on any ascendancy, most of which are varying minion setups, but the most popular is once again Kinetic Blast of Clustering, utilising that buffed attack speed scaling on Corpse Pact from the change in 3.27. But almost overtaking the Necromancer for the second spot is the Slayer, and we need to discuss melee for a moment, because slams have been incredibly dominant, especially as a powerhouse league starter ever since the buffs in patch 3.25. However, slams took quite the hit in 3.28, including a targeted nerf at Earthshatter itself, and whilst they still provide a respectable starter setup on the Slayer or the Berserker, they no longer have a huge advantage over other melee options. In fact, one of the most notable melee options in 3.28 isn't a slam at all, it's Elemental Hit, which saw a rise in popularity in the Freesia 2.0 event, and a continuation of that trend into Mirage League. Where slams rely on Warcries and a decent axe to provide the majority of their damage, Elemental Hit scales its output directly from the gem itself, which lends incredibly well to a league start scenario where you may not have access to a good weapon. This setup also leans on the strengths of the Slayer defensively, providing massive amounts of recovery. And speaking of massive recovery, one ascendancy that has been resilient near the top for several leagues despite a number of changes is the Chieftain. In fact, this ascendancy has pretty much remained at a static 10% play rate for level 95 plus characters for 3 straight leagues, which is especially surprising for 3.28, considering the large direct nerfs to cast when stunned builds, one of the primary transitional endgame setups for the Chieftain Righteous Fire starter to move into after accruing some currency. However, there is actually quite a big shift going on here, but it's being obscured by a newly added support gem that we need to discuss in this video: Minion Pact. This new exceptional support gem is just ridiculous. The numbers on this one are completely overpowered, which is why it is already confirmed to be banned in the upcoming Gauntlet event. Minion Pact grants flat physical damage scaling from a sacrificed minion's life upon spell cast, and in optimized builds, this is providing upwards of 25,000 flat added damage, far more than you can obtain from any other source. This has led to a lot of different Minion Pact builds popping up, including those designed to one-shot Uber Pinnacle bosses, but the most notable is the Blade Vortex version due to the interaction of snapshotting the added damage. Of all of the level 95 plus chieftains in Softcore Trade Mirage League, 17% of them are using Minion Pact, and 90% of those are Blade Vortex builds, providing a new aspirational endgame setup for this ascendancy after Righteous Fire, beyond just the usual cast when stunned. However, because Minion Pact provides so much added damage, it also enables a lot more investment into defense, which is another huge upside of the Chieftain, and why we're seeing half of all of the characters using this new exceptional gem pick this ascendancy in 3.28. Now, it wouldn't feel right to cover the defensive meta for 3.28 without mentioning Ward, because the introduction of a new timeless jewel, Heroic Tragedy, has created entirely new builds in Mirage League. These setups are not too popular, with about 1% of level 95 plus builds using this new jewel combined with Yinda's Stand. But considering Ward has mostly been a meme stat outside of a few very niche setups, this is quite a respectable number of builds being represented in this league. The Heroic Tragedy Jewel has introduced some new timeless keystones, the most notable of which is Celestial Mathematics, which provides flat cold damage for attacks based on breaking your own ward. This one is seeing a lot of use with the buffed Static Strike, enabling a playstyle that can benefit the large chunk of added damage without the need to forcibly break your ward all too often. But there's also new ward loop builds cropping up too, which utilise the newly added cast on ward break to spam out tons of spells. Those ones are probably not going to make it to 3.29 if I were to make a guess. Okay, let's discuss life versus energy shield for a moment, because this has been one of the big topics ever since the addition of tier 17s in Necropolis League. Energy shield stacking setups have been extremely dominant, and Chaos Inoculation seemed to go from strength to strength. But in 3.27, following the changes to the Trickster and the addition of Bloodline classes, and the introduction of several new life-stacking enablers in the form of the Grey Wind and the Foulborn Wrathpit Globe, to name a few, CI began to decline. In fact, a whopping 36% of level 95 plus builds in 3.26 were using Chaos Inoculation, but that number had decreased to 26% in 3.27. And for the first time in many leagues, Chaos Inoculation finds itself no longer the most popular keystone in 3.28, now sitting at just 17% of level 95 plus characters in softcore trade Mirage. That's a fall of more than 50% over the course of 2 leagues, and it aligns with the trend of popular ascendancies in 3.28. Another aspect at play here though is the general difficulty of the endgame in Mirage, which has been toned down a little bit, freeing up many of the restrictions that were in place that were stifling build creativity, so that more archetypes can flourish in harder content. Uber Pinnacle bosses remain, and they still pose the same challenge, but access to the Ubers has been shifted, and the most rewarding content is no longer hidden behind a few specific modifiers that limited builds to a handful of options. Generally speaking, there are a lot more options available in 3.28 endgame in regards to builds, and this combined with the core addition of Foulborn Uniques, the reintroduction of infamous modifiers, and new tools for the Ward archetype, to name a few, has created an interesting meta for 3.28. The endgame feels more fresh than it has done for a very long time indeed. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.